Good evening, and thank you for being here in the midst of these challenging times. My name is Scout Meredith Best, and I am Student Project Manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. When we held Clark Forum events in person, we took a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered belonged to Indigenous people for centuries prior to European settlement. Currently, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Susquehannock, the Lenape, the Conestoga, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Erie, and later the children of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I encourage everyone watching this evening's program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional lands you currently inhabit. On behalf of Dickinson College's Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues and the Department of Political Science, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Analyzing the 2020 Elections in Pennsylvania, a panel discussion. In the days following the 2020 general election, Pennsylvania became the center of conversation regarding mail-in voting, with erstwhile President Donald Trump making unfounded claims about election fraud. Pennsylvania's mail-in voting policy faced both praise and criticism. Originally intended as an example of bipartisanship, Act 77 allowed residents of Pennsylvania to vote by mail without any excuse. And with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, public health experts praised the move, which allowed the 2020 elections to go forward without any unnecessary spread of the virus. However, after Donald Trump lost Pennsylvania to his rival Joe Biden, numerous lawsuits were filed regarding potential fraud that Trump claimed took place. As a lifelong resident of Pennsylvania myself, I requested my mail-in ballot for the 2020 election with some trepidation. I wanted to ensure my vote was counted and not contested. However, my fears about mail-in voting were appeased as the process went smoothly and efficiently. I felt grateful that I didn't have to put my or my family's health at risk during the pandemic. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speakers. Valerie Gaydos has served in the 44th Legislative District, Pennsylvania House of Representatives since 2018. She is a longtime entrepreneur with a proven track record of building businesses. She is a graduate of Dickinson, class of 1989. Matt Haverstick has represented government officials, private entities, and individuals in litigation and appeal cases for the last 25 years. He has been referred to in media reports as the counsel of choice for state Republicans in a number of recent policy fights for his work on matters that garner national press attention. Jean Foschi serves as the vice chairman for the Cumberland County Board of Commissioners. She has worked as a paralegal, a business collection specialist, and a business lending analysis, as well as a legal librarian. Sarah Niebler will be moderating tonight's discussion. She is an associate professor of political science at Dickinson College and teaches about American politics, including campaigns, elections, and public opinions. She is currently working on a research project examining the level of nationalization in the 2020 election in South Central Pennsylvania. There will be a question and answer session immediately following this program, so please type any of your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time. Please post questions only in the live chat feature, as this is not the space for exchanging personal opinions during the presentation. Thank you for attending. You may now all begin.
Thank you, Scout, for your introductions. And I was going to say I'd love for my fellow panelists to make their video live so everyone can see the full panel if you can do that. So thank you. So as I said, thank you, Scout, for your introductions. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening. Before I turn things over to our panelists, I want to say just a few things, some of which Scout has already mentioned. The year 2020 brought a number of changes to election systems and rules in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In fall 2019, Act 77 was passed by the Republican-controlled state legislature and signed into law by Democratic Governor Tom Wolf. It eliminated straight party ticket voting, changed the voter registration deadline, and provided funding to help counties buy new voting machines with a paper trail. Perhaps most significantly, however, especially in retrospect, was that Act 77 also allowed Pennsylvania voters to cast their ballots by mail without providing an excuse. Anytime changes are made to voting procedures, uncertainty about election security increases. But add to this a global pandemic, a historic number of voters casting their ballots by mail, a post office with significant delivery delays, and a former president who sowed and continues to sow seeds of discontent with the election process, and we have an environment where dealing in facts becomes eminently important. Along those lines, I want to be clear that the results of the 2020 election in Pennsylvania and across the country were counted accurately, and there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. A joint statement from top federal agencies in charge of election security stated that the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history, and that, quote, there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised, end quote. The Brennan Center for Justice finds that voter fraud is incredibly rare and certainly not widespread. Citing a host of academic studies on the topic, they find that impersonation fraud by voters rarely happens, and that it is more likely that an American, quote, will be struck by lightning than that he will impersonate another voter at the polls, end quote. Second, they cite court cases and government investigations that also conclude fraud by voters at the polls is nearly non-existent. Even in states that have granted their election officials widespread powers to prosecute voter fraud or done thorough investigations into specific issues related to voter registration and the casting of ballots, government officials have prosecuted voter fraud cases only very infrequently and have obtained convictions even more infrequently. Finally, a Business Insider article from February 21st, 2021 outlined all the court cases brought by former President Trump, his campaign, and Republican allies that aimed to overturn the 2020 presidential election results. They found that at least 42 legal challenges had been brought forth and that none of them had ultimately been successful. The Trump campaign initially had an individual win in a Pennsylvania court case related to when first-time voters casting ballots by mail needed to confirm their identity with their county board of elections. However, the state Supreme Court ultimately overturned that more local decision. Including that case, there were over 15 attempts to contest the election results in the Commonwealth in local, state, and federal courts. And again, all of them failed in court. As a political scientist, I aim to arm my students and community members with facts about the voting process, especially in Cumberland County and in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think registering to vote and casting a ballot should be a straightforward process with as few hurdles as possible for Pennsylvania voters to clear. I look forward to the discussion of the 2020 election and what you all think the future of voting should look like in Pennsylvania. Commissioner Foschi, we'll start with you and then go to Representative Gaydos and Mr. Haverstick. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you, Professor Niebler, and it's just such an honor to be here with the Clark Forum. I really appreciate being invited to speak at this event. Thank you. So I just want to set the stage in Cumberland County, and I'm not sure that everyone knows, but the 3 commissioners in Cumberland County, in years in which they are not up for re-election or election, they are the 3 members of the Board of Elections. So, you know, this becomes very personal as we get into this. So if you could just bear with me. But as I set the stage, I think if we remember back in 2019 in Cumberland County had to purchase new voting machines because of the settlement of a lawsuit with the Jill Stein campaign that said that voting machines in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have to have a paper ballot backup. So Cumberland County spent about, I think it was a little more than $4 million on those machines, and we fronted the money, right? We were told there'd be some kind of money coming, but no one knows what it is. And $4 million is a lot to the taxpayers of Cumberland County. So the money is fronted. We're headed into 2020. I'm a newly elected official. I take office January 6th of 2020. We start this really nice campaign of getting these beautiful ES&S machines out to Cumberland County residents. We go all over the county and demonstrate these machines. Our Bureau of Elections is doing this fabulous job. People are loving these machines. They can see, you know, in the pretend vote what they're voting for. They watch that ballot, you know, that printed ballot come down. It goes down into the sleeve and it's held. People think it's great. We know that we're going to have some kind of an absentee ballot turnout, right? The mail-in ballot turnout, but we don't think it's going to be enormous. It has not traditionally been enormous in Cumberland County. We're planning for pretty much a normal in-person election. And then COVID happens. And when COVID happens, everything changed for us. So all of a sudden people are saying, well, I'm going to vote by mail-in ballot. And our governor is saying, we cannot enforce masking regulations in polling places. It's not constitutional. We cannot enforce masking regulations in polling places. So there's a group that's saying, I'm going to the polling place to vote. And there's a huge group saying, I am not getting anywhere near a polling place to vote. I don't feel safe. It's a way to pass this virus. And so then in effect, Cumberland County, our Bureau of Elections is doing two different types of elections on the same day. They're doing an in-person election and they're working a mail-in ballot election. And one of the things that was so concerning to me as a member of the Board of Elections was the amount of information that was out there that was misinformation. And then there was, of course, some that people did not understand, but the volume of phone calls that came into the Bureau of Elections was unbelievable. And I mean, rightfully so. People can say, I just heard this on the television. I don't understand. You're trying to steal this election, or my mail-in ballot isn't going to be counted. The president is going to stop the mail-in ballot count. I mean, all of these things went on. They went on for months and months and months. And I'm sure people are aware that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there were counties that lost their administrators of their Bureau of Elections during that election period and then right after it, because it was unbelievably intense. And the scrutiny from the public and the misinformation that evolved around that was unbearable at some points in time. The other thing that happened during that election with those mail-in ballots was the state guidance changed sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on a weekly basis. You know, we can think we're going down the correct path. We can plan that we're going down the correct path, and like this, everything changes. And then there's a need to pivot. Sometimes there's a need to completely turn around. That was alarming. It was alarming for the voters of Cumberland County. It was alarming for the Bureau of Elections, for the good people that do that work. But despite all of these obstacles, Cumberland County delivered a fair and accurate and a reliable election. And I have to tell you, Professor Niebler is a member of the Board of Elections who watched all of this happen with limited resources, with limited space. I was personally feeling the slap in the face when members of our own delegation in Cumberland County came out and said there was fraud in this election. It really was a slap in the face to the good work that Cumberland County did.
Thank you, Commissioner Foschi. Representative Gaydos.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this forum. This is great. And as a graduate of Dickinson 1989, I had attended many Clark Forum events and found them really, really valuable and interesting, and just met a lot of folks who were brought to campus. And this is a real honor to be here. So this is my second term, my first re-election. And so, you know, it was definitely really interesting. Now, my background, as you talked a little bit, I've been in business for 25 years prior to running for office, and this was my reelection for a second two-year term. Let me just preface almost everything that I say is that as I've been in business for 25 years, party affiliation has never been a factor in making decisions. I'm a data person, I'm information. I had a database company, and so I like to delve deep into data. So this is certainly one of these issues that there's a lot of data, and in fact, the data can be very overwhelming. So, you know, we talked a little bit about, you know, fair, accurate, and reliable election. I would actually say that, you know, reliable is probably not a word we could be using. Fair, accurate, probably not a whole lot of that either. You know, this race was probably the most contentious because there were a lot of personalities involved. And so what I found is that the extremes on both sides, so for example, folks who say that there is no fraud, I'm not sure you can actually say that. And if you can say that there, you know, this is absolutely completely free, fair, accurate, and reliable, can't say that either. So I'm going to say that both sides are actually wrong. And it's somewhere right down in the middle where we're not talking with the same terms. And that's what made this whole process really complicated, is because before you can accuse somebody of fraud, you got to define it, right? Before you can accuse whether it's accurate, reliable, we got to all be talking the same terms. And so in all fairness, we haven't been doing that. And the we is pretty much everybody. So, let me give an example of in my district, and I could tell you intimately with my district. So now a House district is based on 62,000 residents, roughly. That's in each state House district. And on average, I think in this election, we had something like 40-some thousand people vote. So let's just round it up to like 40,000 voters. And we had a lot of people come in person, vote at their polls. And of course, we had a number of people come and vote by paper. In Allegheny County, there were issues that, can you call it fraud? Probably not. But the issue is that there were 28,000 ballots in Allegheny County that were mailed out with the wrong information on it. And that was just weeks before the election. So for example, in my particular district, there were about 2,000, I think it was maybe 1,800, 2,000 ballots that were sent out that had the wrong name on it. So my own neighbor, 2 doors down, got a ballot that said Representative Rob McCurry and Emily Skopoff. And so I even had another neighbor had called the other neighbor and said, did you get the right ballot? And the one gentleman who was older said, oh, gee, I thought maybe Valerie wasn't running this year. Because of course we all know that we don't always run every single year. And so he had mailed his ballot in, checking off the wrong candidate. So what they ended up doing when they found this out is that they had to mail in 28,000 ballots back to the people who had gotten those wrong ballots and then have it on a corrected form. Now, if you all remember, right before the election, there was so much mail. And people looked at those that said, here's your corrected ballot, and it was supposed to be in an orange envelope. And they probably went, oh, throw that away. I'm not going to vote again. Some people did vote again. We still haven't gotten the information on how many people voted the second time on the correct ballot, how many people voted correctly on the first ballot, and how many people ignored it totally. This data is actually not reconcilable. So, is that considered fraud? I wouldn't consider it fraud, but I would call it unreliable. Is it accurate? Not accurate. Is it fair? It's not fair when, a number of my voters were disenfranchised because they weren't able to vote. But what did happen was that the county then said, all right, how are we going to fix this? They had a discussion and they decided that they were going to count the ballots of the races that were correct. So if somebody got a ballot that didn't have my name on it in my district, but they checked off president and the congressional district, so that was correct on that ballot, then they counted those ballots. So essentially, I have not gotten a count of how many people were in this kind of limbo that did not get their vote counted. So, so there were a lot of, that's just one example, just, to try to explain how it's complicated. It's not that simple where you say that, this was fair or this was fraud, or it's just not reconcilable. And so we go back to Act 77, and of course I could talk forever on this. So please, just wave your hand if you want me to kind of move on this. But that's where Act 77, when Act 77 came in, we had voted for Act 77 because I think, I don't have any problem with doing paper ballots. I've done absentee ballots before when I was traveling on business, and they worked just fine. But there were some changes in there that I think that were not great. But, a lot of times we vote for things that or not 100%, but if there's a lot, you compromise. That's part of what we do. But it was intended to create that paper trail, but at the end of the day, it didn't create a paper trail, because going back to what Commissioner said, is that there were just these ever-changing rules from the governor's office that just confused and frustrated a lot of the people, the good people who were working at these polls. So that's just an example of some of the challenges. And I'll leave time for the rest of the discussion, and really welcome an open discussion on this.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Mr. Haverstick?
First of all, thanks for all the participants, and Professor. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I agree with Rep. Gaydos. It's a nice forum for all of us to exchange ideas and hear different viewpoints. So from my perspective, and I had a litigation for a state senatorial candidate, actually from Allegheny County and Beaver County. So I had a ringside seat to what I would consider to be problems in the implementation and then interpretation of mail-in balloting. I think there's a tendency for all of us to see this election in particular through the prism of our partisanship. And so if, there's certainly, elements of the Republican Party who want to look at the election as hopelessly fraudulent and unrecoverable. I don't feel that. I don't see that it was hopelessly fraudulent. I think, in fairness, though, our Democratic friends need to acknowledge that they see this election through the prism of winning, especially in the presidency. And I think that's probably caused a glossing over of some of the structural problems in the implementation of Act 77. And let me talk about those for a couple of minutes, and then we can talk some more about it later. As a lawyer, norms and predictability in norms are how we do our business. We need predictable rules so that we can structure arguments, so that we can know the next time in 2 years, and it'll be less than 2 years from now when there's an election again. There'll be a special, I'm sure, coming up. We need to be able to understand and articulate rules and what they mean, and trust that they will be interpreted in a consistent way, maybe not the way we want, but at least in a consistent way from election to election. And we had the double whammy of this election of the implementation of large scale non-absentee balloting, just flat out mail-in balloting. We knew, there was going to be a lot of it because of COVID, and we had a highly contentious presidential that really, early on, some folks decided to make mail-in balloting sort of a fulcrum for whether it was going to be good or bad. And it was a rough time, frankly, for the trial by fire of mail-in balloting in Pennsylvania, and I really don't think it worked as well as acknowledged. I agree with Representative Gaydos, and I got to see this firsthand. The rulemaking and rule declaration from the Secretary of the Commonwealth was really poor. The communication of rules and the changes in rules or interpretations of rules was similarly poor. And some counties got it and some didn't. Some counties had an understanding of the rules and others didn't. I mean, we don't tend to all see this, because unless you're in Rep. Gaydos's business or mine, you don't necessarily get to all 67 or most 67 counties in the Commonwealth. But I can tell you, in this election, there was nowhere near uniformity in the interpretation of these rules on a county by county basis. And the problem there isn't which rule is the right one. It's that some citizens in the Commonwealth are voting with one set of rules and others are voting with others. And that's just a recipe for disaster. And our courts, frankly, weren't much more of a help either. And I'm not talking about the federal courts or even state Supreme Court with respect to some of the allegations of flat out fraud, some of the litigation in Philadelphia and things like that. That's not what I mean. But I do think there was a failure by our courts, including our state Supreme Court, to adhere to a jurisprudence one that may not be popular in all quarters, but one that's at least consistent and predictable. And, you know, again, for our Democratic friends, that all sounds like sour grapes because it turned out, I think, the way a lot of folks on the side of the aisle wanted it. But the note of caution there is when you allow entities like the Secretary of the Commonwealth or courts to not adhere to consistency and to not adhere to a really defined jurisprudence and a predictable jurisprudence, that sets up problems that will persist irrespective of party and irrespective of who's running an election. And, you know, and I promise you what none of us want on, you know, in either political party is appellate courts that decide election law issues by caprice, in ways that look arbitrary, in ways that aren't predictable, in ways that are confusing, because all of those things then lead some folks to the conclusion that the courts aren't actually judging the facts and law anymore. They're picking winners and losers. And I'm not going to go so far as to say what I think or say I think that happened in the case of Nicole Ziccarelli, the client I represented, who lost an election largely because of state Supreme Court judgment. It wasn't a decision because there was no majority, that certain votes that were illegal were going to be counted anyway. I appreciate that. I didn't like the way that turned out, but the bigger problem for me with that result is it doesn't square with prior decisions of that court, and that's just a dangerous road for us to go down.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about Act 77 and the implementation piece, because I think, Matt, you pointed out, rightfully so, that the implementation of Act 77 coincided with COVID and just this massive increase in mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania that, as Commissioner Foschi said in her opening remarks, no one saw coming in October of 2019 when Act 77 was passed, or in January of 2020 when counties started planning for this. So I want to think about, how can we separate out those issues, and then to think about, or how can we separate out the changes made from Act 77 to the changes that that resulted due to COVID, and what do we think the future will look like in terms of mail-in ballots? But perhaps even more interestingly and more importantly, pulling off of some of the comments Matt made about implementation and about implementation of elections, is one of the solutions to some of the disparities that you saw at the county level to make elections even more controlled by the state or the federal government. That certainly seems like it would implement or would allow for more uniformity in results, but we all know elections have traditionally been given to the counties to implement. And I'm just curious what you all think about that going forward. And then we can get into a little bit more of some of the changes to voting rules and amendments to Act 77 potentially.
So I'll comment that the I think that when we were looking at Act 77 in the first place, there were a couple of reasons that it was pushed to be implemented. And I know I had questions. I said, gosh, these are a lot of changes, even for a presidential election, because I thought that we were clearly going to have more people coming out, and wouldn't it be best to try changes on an off election year, just to kind of walk them in there. But essentially, what was the big concern was, and going back to, they wanted to have a paper trail because look, there were a lot of concerns about foreign interference. There were concerns about election machines, and that was on both sides of the aisle. And I think that President Trump had issued a couple executive orders on that manner that this was something that we wanted to be concerned about. So what Act 77 did was that it made going into your election precinct using the same exact piece of paper that when you mailed it in. So it was creating that audit trail. But What I will tell you though, and I recommend that if anyone who's viewing this right now, that if you want to look at the Pennsylvania Auditor General's 2019 report and the audit that was done this was December of 2019. Eugene D. Pasquale had determined that there were a lot of things that were of great concern. And if you just read the executive summary, we found that the voter record information is inaccurate due to the weaknesses in the voter registration application process and the maintenance of voter records in the SURE system. It goes on and on and on. We were going to be addressing those in 2020, and then of course COVID hit. So, there was a flawed system at the base of this. And there were many of us that just said, wait, why are we doing Act 77 now? But, there was a concern because of potential interference that was a concern on both sides.
I was going to defer to the commissioner, but I've said a bunch of this earlier, but to some degree, the first time you roll out a ballot program on this scale, they're going to be teething problems, and I expected that there would be those things, and we wouldn't be able to predict what they all were. We would just know them when they popped up, and there are things that we'd have to try to fix on the fly, and then go back and work out after the election, so that again there could be some consistent guidelines for the counties. I don't think. First of all, I think there'd be 67 counties furious if the Commonwealth or Washington D.C. tried to tell them how to run their elections. And I don't think that's what the doctor ordered here. I think though that we should take the lessons we learned and be able to give the counties a more coherent and frankly accurate playbook for or like a help guide for, okay, if you have this problem, here's the solution. If somebody's ballot comes in and they didn't sign it and date it, this is what you do with it. That's the kind of thing that I think in the next election, and hopefully it'll be available for some of the specials that are coming up, we'll be able to give to counties that are going to be going through special elections and then be able to implement more broadly in 2022.
So I'd like to talk about the election code in Act 77, because quite frankly, I didn't write it. I didn't vote for it, but now it's an unfunded mandate. And even if it's funded, it's still a mandate, and it is clear as mud. It is archaic, it is clear as mud, and that's all there is to it. So, guidance, we need to decide what's guidance and what is statutory. And if it's statutory, then it absolutely has to be followed. And the law really does need to be cleared up in that way. We have to get away from guidance, right? Because then that's what leads to every county doing whatever the heck it wants to. And I don't really think that happened. And Representative Gaydos, I empathize with what happened to you. And quite frankly, I think that's a problem at the Bureau of Elections. I don't think that's fraud. I think that was a systemic problem, okay? But we have to have election code reform in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have to have, moving forward, some work done to Act 77 and Act 12. And the first thing that could happen at the legislative level, Representative Gaydos, is you bring these counties to the table. The people that are doing this work every day. Our Cumberland County Director of Elections, I know she'd love to come to the table and say, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, because she did deliver a fair, accurate, and reliable election in Cumberland County. And to say anything else is wrong. It is absolutely wrong in Cumberland County. She does her job. That entire group does their job. But bring them to the table and talk to them about what is wrong in this election code and what needs to be fixed. And then we need the political will to fix it. I know we're headed to another primary, and we're not going to change how we pre-canvass mail-in ballots in time for that primary. Counties need at least 15 days to do that pre-canvass ahead of election day. It just sets it up to be smoother, not only for our electorate, for our voters, but for our candidates, right? It's part of doing a good job. And so, I mean, Representative Gaydos, like, the ball's in your court. You get to go back and say, this is what needs to happen. The County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania has put together many, many points on what needs to happen. And I know they're lobbying for those things. They're lobbying for those changes to that election code. So it's time to get the work done. And I know it will not happen in time for the primary.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And, you know, what people also need to understand is that, you know, when this legislation is as complex and big as Act 77 comes down, you know, there's a lot of people negotiating and discussing, and sometimes, you know, too many cooks do, you know, ruin the broth. And I think, you know, perhaps maybe there was too many compromises that were put in there. And that just makes for these problems. I mean, it's the nature of drafting legislation. But as I said, that I spoke out in a number of occasions and just said, you know, are we ready for this? And plus, you know, there were just some elements within the legislation. But again, there's 203 House members, there's 50 senators, and you know, people did come to the table to kind of negotiate some of these things, and obviously there were a lot of problems with it.
And you know, Representative Gaydos, I know one thing that people in Cumberland County, what we would like to have some clarification on, and it's not related to the conversation here, but it is related to the election code. You know, there's that piece of the election code that says there shall be no posting of political materials in a polling place. Define posting, right? That needs to be done in the election code. Okay, that can't be up to individual county guidance, because in Cumberland County, we do one thing, the Attorney General gives other guidance. Okay, and so it's all up for debate, county by county by county. Firming those things up statutorily, I believe, would help.
I'm gonna try to.
What you were saying about at what point do we move from county administration to state administration, and where are we comfortable with that line being? I'm interested.
Well, I want to help out, although she doesn't need it, Representative Gaydos, or how about put it this way, give a little help to the legislature. I mean, elections are really complex, and there's been a long-standing recognition that there's no such thing as a perfect election. And I don't think that I think it would be impossible. I mean, in the same way that it was impossible to predict all the potential problems with mail-in balloting on this scale, it'd be impossible to go through the election code and figure out ahead of time every particular problem and then legislate. I mean, the election code would be longer than it already is. I mean, I hear you. You're right. I mean, there needs to be a lot of this needs to be moving away from the ad hoc guidance. And I think that was a big problem in this cycle with the Secretary of the Commonwealth, because sometimes the guidance was mandatory until it wasn't. Sometimes the guidance would say one thing and then it would say something else. And I hear you, and I feel for you. It's hard to know which one of the Secretary's guidances you were supposed to follow. But I think there's a way we can get it better without making the election code, you know, 10,000 volumes long. And I think we'll try to hopefully the General Assembly, that is, will be able to correct some of the, you know, the glaring problems this time around and give you some statutory answers that you're right. You don't have to debate whether they actually apply.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, posting. I mean, I think I'm not sure whether you need to define the term posting in legislation. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. Anything that's available for public viewing, whether it's on the floor or whether it's on a wall, or whether, I mean, posting is posting.
Representative Gaydos, I'm going to ask you this question about posting, because I love this question. Okay, if I walk in with my slate card in my hand and I keep it out, have I posted campaign material? I mean, that's how unclear it is, right? I mean, those are all the conversations that we have, right? If I put my slate card in my pocket, I mean, that seems like the natural thing to do, right? I'm going to put it in my pocket. I'm going to get behind the curtain. I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to vote. Okay, but people don't want to do that, right? They're like, it's my right to bring that in. It's my constitutional right to bring that in. That's not posting. Define posting, please.
Oh, I think that's you've answered it. I mean, look, you're not allowed to bring political material into the polls.
And then
period.
Representative Gaydos, if I can't bring it in, Okay, I can't bring it in because this is how this works. You say to someone, a judge of elections says to someone, you can't bring that in. Well, I'm bringing it in. Well, we cannot constitutionally deny anyone the right to vote.
So now you're talking about behavioral issues. I mean, this is a whole nother.
But there are issues in that code, right? Define posting. If you just define it, if you just firm it up, then we could move forward. Now, I know what the AG's guidance says, okay? And the AG's guidance is on the website, and it's pretty easy to follow, and it makes sense, okay? But is guidance or is guidance statutory? It's not statutory at all.
So, I get it. I mean, if you're hung up on, an issue like posting, I mean, we've got big issues. Like, for example, it is
a big issue in Cumberland County. I mean, to say that that's not a big issue is dismissing the constituents that I have in Cumberland County that think it's a big issue. I mean, not getting pre-canvassing done before this primary election is dismissing the constituents in Cumberland County and what they worry about.
So let's come back to some of those bigger issues. Representative Gaydos, respond quickly, and then we'll come back to some of the bigger issues go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so for example, I mean, here are issues that we have to address is that when we don't, here's the thing is sometimes we don't even know how these things happen, but we have to look into them. We have to do an audit. We have to follow up on this. And when people say, oh, we shouldn't do an audit and we shouldn't follow up, that's actually insulting to constituents as well, because, my constituents were calling me by 9 a.m. and saying, Valerie, I just walked into the poll and they told me that I can't vote or I have to vote by provisional because I did a mail-in ballot. I didn't ask for one. I didn't receive one. I didn't send one in. And so what do? They're forced to do a provisional ballot. And we all know, I mean, here's the reality is that when ballots are counted, unless there's a contested race, a lot of the provisional ballots just don't get counted. So now we're walking forward. Okay, so on the ballot, or the provisional ballot where, when they started counting the ballots a couple days later and they were looking at those provisionals and they would pull up, let's say, Katie's ballot and it says, she said she voted or she did not ask for a ballot. She did not vote. They would have to then say, okay, well, let's see, did she vote? They would then look through the outside envelopes and they would say, okay, there's Katie's ballot. It says she did mail it in. Now it's her word versus the county's word. And she's like, that's not my ballot. I didn't do it by paper. Now there's no signatures because the governor says you don't need to have a signature on it. So here the county is counting a ballot, or they actually already did because they started counting the ballot at 7 a.m. That privacy envelope has already been removed from the paper ballot, thrown in with the rest of the ballots. Look, not to use a crude example, but if that was a urine sample, they'd have to throw out the whole entire, batch because there is no way for corrective action. That's what we're really talking about.
Gaydos, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you.
So
about what?
About the process, and I am confused as to why you think those things, and I think you think them for a reason, and maybe you've seen something that has happened like that.
When you're referring to things, please identify what you're referring to.
That the privacy envelope is taken and removed and thrown in with ballots. That does not happen. That does not happen. There is a procedure for what to do with that privacy envelope.
From the issue at what we're talking about, it is removed and detached and put into a different pile away from the outside envelope. So once that privacy envelope is taken out away from that into whatever happens next, it still is now, you cannot recover that and put it back into that envelope to say, look, did Katie vote? Katie says she did not vote by paper.
Representative Gaydos, the privacy envelope has no information on it.
So
it's a privacy envelope.
So we're
that's the whole point. The privacy envelope has been detached. It started counting at 7 a.m.
Counting does not start at 7 a.m.
Well, it didn't in Cumberland County, and that
It
was,
did not. It's not legal to count at 7 a.m. on the day of the election. You can
7:30, they
pre-canvass.
started counting. They started
But there's
counting.
a difference between a pre-canvass and a count. Very different.
It
They're
was
two different
removed
things.
from the outer envelope.
I'd like.
It was removed from the outer
Spread
envelope.
out. I will give you that.
It
I will
was,
give you that.
so you're distracting the issue here.
I'm not.
Okay,
I'm
yes, you are.
I'm
So
concerned
let's-
about your words, Representative Gaydos, because they matter.
I'm
And what
concerned
really
about your
concerned
words.
about is that maybe in Allegheny County, come to Cumberland County and spend some time with our Director of Bureau of Elections. You can talk with her on the phone. I think she could help you with this piece.
So there is no way to match. Okay, so let's say that envelope, okay, whatever happens to that privacy envelope could be set on the table, could be moved over to the table. It doesn't matter. What we're talking about is that there is no way to say that when Katie says she didn't vote on paper, how do you?
Well, what happens to the exterior envelope that clearly shows that she signed the envelope?
No, because, okay, if there's no signature, thank you for pointing that out.
But
Because
there
the
is.
governor then ruled that you didn't have to have a signature. So thank you very much for proving my point.
So you know that ballot comes in 2 envelopes, right?
so I think.
Okay, 2 envelopes. One, you fill it out, you sign it, you put your ballot in the security envelope.
Maybe
you
Mark
put it all together.
needs to answer this question since he
Maybe.
dealt with this issue with signatures.
Commissioner, respectfully, I'm sure in Cumberland, it worked really well. I can tell you from experience, it does not work that well everywhere else. In larger counties, there are mistakes. I mean, I saw them. I mean, no system is perfect, and this one wasn't. And we had a heck of a time, and some of them have impacted my case, some of them didn't, particularly in Allegheny County, with canvassing and counts that were being done, I would argue, in a way that was inaccurate or that was done in a way contrary to rules that were promulgated by the governor. And I don't, don't get me started about Philadelphia County. And I don't.
Maybe that happened. I don't know, but I will tell you, Representative Gaydos, Cumberland County can seriously help with this issue. Bring us to the table.
Yeah, Commissioner.
Bring us to the table.
And I think what we're seeing here is that no matter what, there are decisions that have to be made about the order. If we have mail-in balloting, and we're going to have some version of mail-in balloting, we've always had some version of absentee or mail-in balloting, right? That's not going away, full stop. And so I think the questions that we need resolved are which order takes precedent and which order when do we remove the secrecy envelope, the privacy envelope, compared to when people might show up and vote in person? If they have sent in a ballot before, they think they have, or they think they have not, these are all questions that need to be addressed. But I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions from the folks that are tuning in this evening. So Scout, I'm going to toss to you if you have some questions from our audience, and if not, we can examine some of the bigger issues or think about that. But I do want to throw it to you if you've got some questions.
Yes, thank you very much for this very informative and passionate event. I've learned a lot tonight. So our first question is the evidence of constitutional structure issues at all level of federal and state inadequacies to function in a 21st century? Is this relative to most government levels in a democracy?
Can you read the first part of that for me again?
Mm-hmm.
Is the evidence of constitutional structure issues at all level of federal and state inadequacies enough to function in the 21st century?
I'm not sure I get the question. I'll take a stab at it. If the question is, are there inadequacies in the state and federal constitution that are incompatible with 21st century life? I mean, I don't think so. I don't think our constitutions, the state or federal U.S. constitutions, are the problem here. I think it's more a question of either poorly drafted or ill-conceived statutory schemes combined with sometimes corrupt, but most often just inept implementation of those schemes, of those legislative schemes. And I think the inept implementation of I think Act 77 as a policy matter was questionable to do this year, but it was done. I think it's tough to debate that its implementation by not by the counties, but by the Secretary of the Commonwealth was very poor. And I think that has a lot to do with why there is contention and disagreement among Pennsylvanians about what our election looked like in 2020.
And I guess I would say too, in terms of inept, I mean, I think that word can be inflammatory when you're talking about implementation of justice. But so I think what we're talking about is also some mistakes, right? And I think the scenario that Representative Gaydos talked about at the beginning, dealing with her own district in Allegheny County, it sounds like an administrative mistake.
Yep.
And I think who among us hasn't replied all to an email that we didn't mean to reply all to? That's the best example from my everyday life, right? But so how do we take those mistakes that we know are going to happen in any system and mitigate them to the best of our ability to still allow voters to have confidence in the overall system, which I think we all agree is pretty okay, right? Minus some of these really important issues. But again, how do we set up a system that provides multiple checks at multiple places, that reflects the values that we have, which I think are for the most people to legally participate in the electoral process as possible, all of those things. So,
and let me say, repeat something I said earlier. There's no such thing as a perfect election. There's just never going to be a perfect election. There's going to be nits and problems in every single election we ever have.
Okay.
Whether they reached a level in 2020 in Pennsylvania, especially at the municipal and state level, is an open question. I mean, whether they reached a level beyond the norm of problems is an open question. I think they did, but that's probably subject.
Right, and I think anytime there are any elections that are separated, like the one you litigated out in Allegheny County, by 100 votes, depending on how you adjudicate the last 200 ballots or the last 300 ballots, those elections are always going to be contentious, and someone is always going to be disappointed by the outcome and the way that a ruling comes.
Absolutely.
All right, Scout, next.
With that segue, actually our next question is, do you think we'd be all sitting here having this conversation about voter fraud and irregularities to this degree if Donald Trump had not fanned the flame, so to speak?
I'll start with that one. And I think something very interesting happened during this election. And I would remind everyone that in Cumberland County, Donald Trump won Cumberland County. Okay. There certainly was a statement made about his presidency in Cumberland County, but at the end of the election, he won. He won Cumberland County. Certainly statements made by President Trump flamed the fire. They flamed lots of questions at the Bureau of Elections. And one was, the president is going to call on election night and say at midnight, that's it, votes are counted. And whether that's true or not, whether it's possible or not, it sounds to me like that would be a coup, that would be unconstitutional. People worried about that. It certainly flamed fires of voters in Cumberland County. And I think it's important for all of us, regardless of party, regardless of where we are in the process of representing constituents. People have the right to vote. We are entrusted with protecting the constitutional right to vote for everyone, and that's where we need to be coming from. And so when the president, makes inflammatory statements about, they're stealing this election from me, and I'm going to call the election. I'm going to say you can't count things past midnight. What it's doing is it's taking away people's constitutional right to vote in the United States of America. I mean, we're better than that.
Yeah, I think, let me qualify what the commissioner said, because I generally agree with her. You don't have a right to vote in Pennsylvania or in the United States in some way that's not according to, in Pennsylvania, the election code.
Correct.
And I think a particular, not maybe the only, but a particular unfortunate consequence of the president's inflammatory language about election security and really, I'll acknowledge overblown statements about fraud, at least in the way that it was described, is that kind of rhetoric and commentary distracted attention from real problems in implementation of the election code, so that when some of us wanted to identify modes of voting that weren't fraudulent, but they weren't compliant with the election code either, it was easy for a lot of folks to just lump those arguments and lump that litigation in with the Trump litigation. And they're very different things. Certainly, for the folks on the other side who bought into the notion that there was fraud, those folks weren't really thinking about, well, what are the actual problems with the election that we can work to fix? That language, it wasn't desirable, it wasn't helpful, and I don't think it accurately reflected the real problem with mail-in balloting in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I would absolutely concur. I think that, really well said. And that, that goes to kind of what, I was saying in the very beginning, that it's like there are these, statements on one side, statement on the other side, but everyone was talking past each other. And then there's like a bunch of us who I feel were right in the center going, hey, these are real problems. We need to fix these. And then immediately you get somebody that says, oh, there is no fraud. Yes, there is fraud. And it's like, stop, guys, let's address these issues. And that's really where the problem. And yes, Donald Trump's statements kind of made things lumped all into fraud. And they're not. Okay. But then we also had the media that was saying, no, there absolutely is no fraud. It's all free, fair, it's accurate, it's reliable. Man, not so reliable. I mean, we know that. We know that from our Auditor General's report, and the Auditor General, DePasquale, is a Democrat. They were bringing this stuff to the table that we have to address in Pennsylvania, and we still have to address it.
So Representative Gaydos, when you talk about fraud, I think, the Brennan Center talks about fraud as voters showing up and trying to vote twice, or showing up and, trying to impersonate somebody else and vote. And, that seems to be, so when I talk about voter fraud, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that, because I think this is an important piece. And if we're going to talk about free, fair elections, we absolutely have to start with the definition, I think, of fraud.
That's exactly.
So when I think about fraud, I'm thinking about this voter impersonation. I'm thinking about somebody who tries to cast a ballot both by mail and in person, or something like that. How do you, and again, I think that type of voter impersonation fraud is pretty widely debunked as not a problem in the United States. You can look at, prosecutions, and it's 0.0000001% of ballots passed or cast, something like that. So how do you think about fraud? And when you talk about how do you, is that different than what we're talking about as kind of administrative error or something of that nature?
Yeah, I focus, not on the word fraud, but reliable, and we just talked about how that, with the Secretary of State, that was kind of very mercurial in giving guidance, that's not reliable, so that translated into, people interpreting it differently. So for example, at the polls, and to what we were talking about before, is that there were poll workers who, some people tore up the ballots that were brought in if they had a paper ballot mailed to them, and then they came in to vote in person. Some polls didn't rip them up. People were concerned about that. Where'd they go? Other people, they marked them off or whatever. So, I mean, that's not reliable. If you look at the definition of fraud, if you're just looking at, it just says a person or thing intended to deceive others, typically by unjustifiable means. Look, we had folks, and again, it happens every year. So, when there were people who, for example, and I know some House members who said that there were some people prosecuted in their districts, and that is that, they filled out ballots for people, ballots that were sent to the House that, let's say, were of a previous owner or something. Other people had filled out ballots of in nursing home folks. That's identity fraud. And that's the FBI, those were all turned over to the FBI. So that is something very different. And you're right, it's not super prevalent. I think the frustration for a lot of folks is that when people walked into the polls, they had to sign a book. But when the governor made the decision not, to allow or to waive signatures, that was basically unequal treatment, is what a lot of people felt, is that you got more scrutiny showing up in person than you did mailing in a ballot. But these have to be fixed, and that goes to actually what the Ziccarelli case is. So I'll let.
Well, Rep. Gaydos has it, I think right on the money. I mean, remember that there are protections and requirements grafted on the mail-in balloting because it's, arguably a less secure way of voting than if you show up at the polling place in person and you sign your name in the book. So there are these other requirements that are anti-fraud provisions. It doesn't mean that there's rampant fraud, but we have those extra protections in mail-in in Act 77 to make it an equivalently safe form of voting, like signing and dating. And it's a problem in Pennsylvania when 62 of the 67 counties threw out mail-in ballots that didn't have a date on them, but 5 weren't required to throw those ballots out. Allegheny County was one of those counties. That changed the election for Nicole Ziccarelli in Allegheny County. But I mean, set that particular election aside, we can't have a system, especially when we're talking about anti-fraud provisions, that 62 counties in the Commonwealth have to follow, but then there are 5 counties in the Commonwealth who can get away with not following. I mean, that's in Beaver County, the other county in Nicole's district, the 45th, those residents who didn't date their mail-in ballots had them thrown out. If I lived in Beaver County and I looked to my left and saw Allegheny County not having to follow the same rules that I did, and their votes count and mine didn't, I'd be mad, and that's a problem, and we need to fix it.
Oh, do you have another question for us?
Yes, I do. For our last question, to wrap things up in just a few words each, what do you think the procedure will be to improve communication and improve mail-in voting so it works for everybody involved?
Well, I'll start. If we're going to really improve communication, then we have to bring counties to the table, and bring counties to the table that are doing a good job of this. Okay, that bring those counties to the table. Don't bring the ones to the table that are a concern. That I'm hearing there's a concern about. Bring Cumberland County to the table. I know our director of elections has a lot of really great input, and she would love to share it and be a part of fixing the problem. That election code, it has to be firmed up. It has to be firmed up so that there are more statutory requirements instead of guidance. And once you put guidance out, you can't change it. You can't change it a week before the election. You can't change it 3 days before the election. And you are right. You can't say 5 counties have to do it and the rest of them don't. It makes no sense to me either. So bring counties to the table. And I will say that one of the biggest things that the legislature could do to make mail-in ballots work better for all voters is let them be pre-canvassed before election day. So that means that you can open them. You check the outer ballot, the outer envelope, you take it out of the privacy envelope, you smooth those babies out, and you have them ready to count when it's legally okay to count them. That would change the game for counties dramatically. And if the legislature is going to do a mandate, then fund it, right? Don't make us come up with this extra money. Because, you know, there are a lot of counties that don't have extra money. There are a lot of taxpayers that can't afford these extra things. So if you're going to say you got to do it, you got to know how we're going to pay for it. And don't make us wait 9, 10, 11 months for the money.
Consistent rules applied and enforced consistently. That to me is what I'd like to see in 2022.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think Commissioner, says it exactly correctly when, she's basically going into that, saying that it's that consistency that counts. You can't change rules. And, I have to say, it's just like there were changing rules on both Republicans and Democrats. And, that was bipartisan, that kind of messed it up. But you're right. We have to address these issues, and it's consistency, fairness, and balance.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for joining in and sending in your questions. We really appreciate it, and hope we can do this again, although maybe with a more positive outlook and maybe to reflect on how the process worked better the next time around. So thank you.
Well,
all.
hey, I have a positive outlook, so I think we're gonna address pieces, but every day we're gonna try to address as much as possible.
No, I appreciate it, and I
Thanks.
think it's nice to hear sort of after some of the contention to realize there are places where it is about consistency, and it's about finding the rules that matter, that make a difference and that make things smoother for those that are doing the implementation work. So. And that maybe then reduce, Matt, the amount of lawsuits that you have to deal with after the fact.
Well, no, my parting shot is there's a danger that elections are going to turn into overly litigated affairs and they're going to be decided in courts. That's the last thing we need. Keep lawyers out of elections if you can.
Sounds good. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Sarah, it still says live at the top.
Oh, we're not still live. It says that because I haven't finished the